Good evening, everyone. This is José Niño for the Order and Liberty podcast. Today I'm joined with my irrepressible co-host, Nick Hankoff. How are you tonight, Nick?
Doing well, Jose. It's a really good show. We got a topic that is just it got its tentacles all over every issue. It's really the centerpiece of what I think Order and Liberty is covering. In all the other shows, you cannot separate it from central banking. So this is a great topic for us.
Indeed, it is. I've always seen central banking and easy money as the biggest economic issue to talk about in any serious political discussion because of the fact that it not only has very strong economic implications in terms of how easy money creates enormous distortions in the economy and can potentially lead to inflation, but it's also incredibly culturally transformational in the sense that the way that easy money changes people's time preferences tends to encourage more presentism, short-term behavior, if you will, where people tend to live in the moment and not really plan for the future. And I believe such incentives are absolutely destructive for a civilization. People do not realize that savings, not consumption, is the bedrock of any sound economy and society altogether. And when you give banks, whether they're private or state-owned, monopoly power over the emission of money and printing of money, it can create very perverted incentives. One thing I wanted to ask you, Nick, how did you get into central banking and understanding why we need a sound monetary system?
Well, of course, the answer for almost anyone who's listening to this show most likely, right, would be Ron Paul. And that's just because the central bank of the United States, the Federal Reserve Bank, was never talked about at all. It wasn't just that it was some issue that was a third railer or politically incorrect to bring up. It was like bringing up the life forms that you theorized were on Mars, right? Like it was just out of this world. No one should be talking about it just because it for all intents and purposes did not exist. And that's exactly the way they like it, Jose. Now, Ron Paul brought up the Federal Reserve and just lit a fire on the country, and especially among young folks at the time. We're not that young anymore, right? But the Federal Reserve Bank, the draw on the issue was that it was secretive. It was not quite federal, not quite a reserve, right, as the old saying goes. And in some descriptions, it was called private, with sort of an evil connotation there, that it would be private and not actually part and parcel owned by the Congress. And we can get into some of that because that's not exactly the way you and I might see the issue in those stark terms. But just the idea that the money, I think another common question to bring up with people at that time was, the money that you have in your wallet, the green pieces of paper with dead presidents' faces on them, what do you think that money's backed by? Like, that paper and the ink on it, there's some, maybe some technological safeguards on it that make it different from other pieces of paper. But really, like intrinsically, it's paper. What gives it its value? What is backing that money? And maybe a fair share of people would say gold, Jose. And of course, that has not been the case since 1971, 1933, however far you want to go back. And so to tell people that money is being printed out of thin air, their eyes might go wide, and pretty soon thereafter, actually, they will glaze over again. It is a topic where if you talk about banking or even central banking, it really can push people into just a bored state of mind. But, there's two ways to react when you hear the news that the money is not actually worth anything. It's just worth what people are willing to accept. And of course, the force of the federal government and the U.S. military. When people are forced to accept that fact, they know it doesn't make sense. They know that money should be backed by something of value. And so when they learn that it's not actually backed by anything of value, they have to just either really panic and start to study and start to learn what to do, like try and take some proactive measures, which I think a lot of people did during the Ron Paul years, 2008 and 2012. But other than that, there's not a whole lot one individual can do, and a lot of people will just say, look, how bad could it possibly be? Okay, because before you told me this information, I was fine. And so I'll just go on being fine and pretend I never heard that, or at least pretend that it's not as bad as you say, kind of thing. So these reactions from people, I think maybe it's possible now that more people will be thinking about central banking and the Fed more now than they have since the Ron Paul presidential campaigns, and that's because some of the recent Federal Reserve actions that I know you want to get into regarding the Wuhan Chinese virus, the coronavirus pandemic, and the government's response to it, shutting down the economy and trying to keep things afloat. The Federal Reserve just did some drastic, insane things, and so it did come into the news a little bit. And more, the Fed is becoming an item of news, and it is being, sort of like all things in the mainstream news, it's being twisted and just you're being shown a certain perspective that's favorable to the establishment and the administrative state, and not the whole truth. Certainly the economic truths of the Federal Reserve, not to mention, as you implied, the societal effects and really just the whole history of the Fed. So we are getting somewhat of a picture now, even though it is not the full and clear picture. It's quite an improvement from where we were just 10 or 15 years ago, where the Fed was just, some words on the paper money that you handed around. So it's very slowly becoming part of the public consciousness in whatever faulty form, but it's an interesting time because we're past a point of no return, in that there's no going back to just pretending the Fed doesn't exist or that the Fed isn't important. And now there's really a battle on for what the meaning to America is and America's future. What's the meaning of the Fed in all of this? So why don't we get into and let you go off, Jose, on the QE, the recent Fed happenings, what is bringing the Fed back into the public consciousness?
Well, the Fed is at its core trying to just prop up the economy, specifically the stock market and all these major corporations, and it's selling bonds as usual and buying up all these toxic assets as well for major corporations, but it's doing nothing for Main Street. I've been of the opinion that the Fed really just serves to prop up Wall Street and all these politically connected corporations and keep this entire scam Potemkin economy going for as long as possible. And they're banking on the fact that a lot of other central banks are engaging in such freak show activities, and also the dollar's reserve status, that they can get away with this stuff. And it is kind of true that the dollar, compared to a lot of other currencies, is the least messed up of the currencies, and it has very strong demand. And I could say this as someone from Venezuela, where their currency is monopoly money at this point, if not worthless. And as a result, people turn to the dollar or cryptocurrencies now. But historically, in a lot of third world countries, whenever their tin pot dictators destroy the currencies, the domestic currencies, they end up turning to the dollar or de facto dollarize because the black market activity is so strong. My my view is that there's going to be an eventual correction, but it's probably going to be in 3 to 5 years or so. But I do think that one of the really bad things about the monopolized central banking we have is that it contributes to the excessive financialization of our economy. And as a result, it entrenches a huge disparity in wealth between the upper middle class and higher, and then the rest, because the upper middle class and higher, they can afford to play in the stock market and buy a bunch of stock, whereas lower class people, they get chiseled with fees, all that, and they receive a devalued currency at the end of the day because of the Cantillon effect, which is named after the French Irish economists that observe how when money is printed, the first recipients of the money receive an overvalued currency, which they are able to profit from. Whereas the lower classes, once that money hits them, it's completely devalued and they're stuck in a pinch because they cannot afford to maintain the same type of lifestyles they could previously afford to do so. And it becomes a never-ending death spiral for the lower classes. Really, inflation punishes the savers and rewards debtors and spendthrifts and the politically connected. It's very perverse and it's an unjust economic system, no matter what kind of central banking scheme you have in place. It creates massive economic distortions, and I think it's a very socially explosive type of arrangement to have that will eventually fall apart.
Well, absolutely. And this is part of the reason why the Fed was such a hot issue in 2008 and 2012 for the Ron Paul presidential campaign. And it's just been, I mean, not to get off on a tangent here, but just to mention what momentum was lost for the libertarian movement following that, not to mention the conservative movement. I mean, Ron did run within the Republican Party to offer that voice to a wider audience than just libertarians, right? So the right wing of the United States especially has really dropped the ball on this issue. I mean, Donald Trump did hammer at the Federal Reserve a little bit on Twitter before his presidential campaign, and even during his presidential campaign, he alluded to during his presidential campaign, he alluded to Barack Obama benefiting from a political appointment at the Fed, that artificially low interest rates were propping up the Wall Street stock markets, right? So we had a glimpse of this, that maybe there was going to be a resurgence in populism against the central bank, and that, for whatever reason, Trump has gone on, maybe you could say the easier track in just saying, let me have a piece of this bubble too, blow the bubble up a little bit bigger for me. But we're not going to get off on too much of the finer points of the politics. But I did just want to grasp that recent history, because it is so important to the movement for restoring order, for restoring liberty. The right wing and the libertarian populists have just had this great opportunity handed to them on a silver platter with Ron Paul's presidential campaign, and the effects cannot be underestimated of the Fed. Like, as you say, the people on the lowest rungs of the economic ladder, those with fixed incomes, those who are really dependent on the value of the dollar, are always stuck in a bad spot, because the value of the dollar is going down. I mean, I don't know how much it's worth anymore, but I know that in some 100-year span since the Fed's creation in 1913, so we're well past 100 years now, but somewhere within that span, it lost 96% of its value. For all I know now, it's 99% of its value. You can go take a look and double check me, but it's over 95% at this point. I gotta believe, like, the dollar in our hands now is worth a nickel in 1913 money, okay, or 1920 money, however you want to look at it. And the Federal Reserve, it's very interesting because people wonder, how could the institution of money itself, money, be this corrupt, this bad, and so few people know about it? And so just to bring up one important perspective on this, Hans Hermann Hoppe points out in his glorious book, Democracy, the God That Failed, that fiat paper money backed by nothing, that just is declared valuable across the society through the force of government, this failed tremendously under monarchies. I mean, it was rarely even tried, and when it did, it fell apart rather quickly under monarchies in the 17th and 18th century. But then as we evolved into these democratic republics, these sort of more or less anonymous or just pseudonymous. What do I want to say? I mean, I'm basically saying, like, you don't have a king, you don't have a monarchy, you don't have someone who's in charge. So you put the people in charge. You put these large groups managing the republics, and sometimes it ends up casting a shadow over who's really running the country once it is instituted to be this democratic republic. But that's when we see this international pure fiat system come into play, and it took a little while, but they really rushed it into existence, Jose. I mean, from the turn away from monarchies into democratic republics, how long did it take before the United States went completely off the gold standard? We had 1933, just 20 years after the creation of the Fed. President Roosevelt declares gold virtually illegal, in the sense that he's going to confiscate all the citizens' private held gold. And then in 1971, Richard Nixon takes the last link of the U.S. dollar to gold and breaks that off, so that now dollars are only exchangeable in gold on foreign currency markets. And even that was done away with. Maybe that's when that was done away with, in 1971. So since 1971, across the globe, it's been pure fiat money backed by nothing, and that's only half century ago. So it can be a little overwhelming, but actually, if you think about it in the long historical arc of money and the power of trying to control money, it was very difficult for kings to get away with. Kings could try and clip gold coins and steal some of the gold out of the larger supply, but often because of the risk involved with kings borrowing from commercial banks would charge kings higher interest rates, and the royal family or the kings would pay higher interest rates. And now it's like the opposite of that. Now the government really pays lower interest rates to commercial banks, but commercial banks don't have to worry about spending less just because the government's spending more. That, like, more money is just being created, new loans are being created, and new money is created to pay off debts to those loans. So we have a sick system now where it's just almost as if no one's held accountable. And unfortunately, when the real economic disaster hits, when there's a real monetary collapse because of all the abuse in this system, we run the risk of people not knowing who to blame for this crisis, this crisis that we're living through now, but one that's going to be just overshadowed by a great giant crisis sometime in the near, maybe if we're lucky, near to mid-term future. And whether or not people will point the blame at the Federal Reserve in the way that maybe they would point the blame at the king before, or know who was in charge of what before a clear state of mind about who the state is or who the government is. Nowadays, it's just like a cloudy sort of, we see this in our politics now, where issues come up that people just blame the wrong people. I mean, we have people on the left blaming people on the right, people on the right blaming people on the left, and of course there are plenty of criticisms that people can bring up in a political discourse. But for some of these central problems, and none is more central than central banking, with this fiat money and nothing backing this monetary system, nothing's more insidious than that, and people just have no understanding of it, and they'd much rather blame some other scapegoat, And of course, the central bank is highly favored in the media, highly favored in academia, and we see this now, and so there's no real hope that people will find the truth on the central banks, except through maybe podcasts like this that open people's minds up and they go out searching in all alternative avenues. But that is one aspect of the danger of easy money in so many ways. It pacifies the society. The society feels like it's getting rich or better off than it otherwise would be because of this cheap credit. And when the bill comes due, a lot of people are going to feel like they're getting robbed, and they have been robbed for a long time. But we're going to end up blaming these mid-size and even some big corporations, but leaving alone the elephant in the room, so to speak, this Federal Reserve system. And it somehow the right wing has to gain this issue back. And I don't know, maybe in another episode we'll have to get into strategy. But this story, if the true history is told, what will have killed America, there's so many aspects you could point to, but you really can't get away from the central bank and the monetary system that we have accelerating all of this disruption in the economy, in the society, as a market, not just of dollars being passed around, but actual relations and cohesion within a society. It goes so much deeper than people think on the surface, Jose.
Yeah, I do believe, as you said, that in this current populist era, you may see a resurgence of anti-Fed sentiment, because if an economic crisis kicks off, that is the perfect opportunity to start scapegoating the Fed, and rightfully so. People will be more skeptical of banks, specifically the big banks, and that's where I think conservatives, libertarians, and people that are skeptics of central banking can make the case for that. In crisis, there's always an opportunity. It's just a matter of exploiting it and taking advantage of it. I hope that more people, more conservatives join, because I've gotten tired over the years when the parameters of economic discussion were only confined to tax cuts and generic deregulation talking points. All that stuff is fine and dandy, but it's so marginal in the grand scheme of things, because as long as you have central banks in place, you could have pretty solid tax reforms and deregulation reforms, but you will never fully extricate yourself from the pitfalls of the boom and bust cycle, which is at the center of all the cyclical downturns that we seemingly have every freaking decade.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is what really annoys me as well, is like this sense of like, does anyone notice a pattern here? Like these boom and bust cycles are becoming more and more obvious because, as you pointed out at the beginning of the podcast, the economy is kept afloat at a very high, like abstract level, at the stock market level, at the corporate level, and maybe there's some sort of mild stimulus to the economy. At this point, people are even laughing off the $1,200 checks they receive in the mail. I feel like it's a little more tangible now. People sort of get what's happening here, that it's very, very little is being done for the Main Street level, and a whole lot is being conjured up at these elite levels. And so the system, people have to be waking up to it at some level. And unfortunately, some go in the opposite direction. And so I think that okay, so one positive, before I get to the negative, on one positive end, in March, when the Federal Reserve announced that it was going down to zero interest rate policy, the ZIRP as it was called, that was a big deal. I mean, that was the Federal Reserve doing a press conference. It was a phone conference to the media, so it wasn't like a big to do, but it was on the phone. Anyone could really tune in, and the Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell was asked about going to negative interest rates, which is sort of wild to think about. Although they do exist, they've never really existed in the United States. But negative interest rates, the fact that it was even brought up, people felt like, and this was, you got to remember the mood of the country in early March and the COVID madness. People were in a panic, or at least I think some were actually trying to push the panic because of political reasons. But for whatever reason, people were ready to panic, right? And we're ready to ask about negative interest rates. And Jerome Powell said, well, not at this time, something to that effect of like, I'm not for negative interest rates, ... at this time. So that seems to be coming in the near future. The same talk of these universal basic income demands where everyone just stays home, no one works, but the government will just send you money. Where's that money going to come from? It's the Federal Reserve. So maybe down the line, as the Federal Reserve becomes clearer in the public consciousness, they're going to have to do more and more to put lipstick on this pig and make people sort of accept or become dependent on the Fed. And how dare you question the Fed? You must be some right-wing extremist or something, right? But so in that side of there was that reaction. I guess I went into the negative before the positive, actually, because the positive reaction out of that was that at least for people like me anyway, was the prices of gold and silver, particularly really silver, just crashed. Like the price of real money went down because so many people were selling their other holdings to get into more liquid cash, right? And so this run to cash dropped. The stock market did not react favorably to this announcement of zero interest rate policy, but that also meant that silver went way down, and a lot of people ran in to buy silver, and you couldn't find silver anywhere. So even though the price was really low, the premiums and the extra markups and the other fees that you would pay, those all shot the prices up, so that the actual real market value of silver was maybe like a third higher than it was on paper. So you couldn't find silver anywhere. And a lot of that, we've seen now a huge spike in the opposite direction, where gold and silver, gold's at an all-time high. Silver is, I don't remember the last time, but it was something like $27, something like that, maybe higher now. I know it had gone as high as $29. So just the point being that if more people, and it does seem like more new buyers are going into these markets, more people are waking up to this stuff, and not just in an intellectual way, but changing their habits, changing the way they do things. There's among all of this COVID madness stuff, we had CNN and CBS and other mainstream outlets running articles telling you, don't take all your cash out of the bank. The cash is dirty. The cash has coronavirus on it. Just use your plastic. You'll be better off. And don't take out cash. And so they're trying to scare people away from using cash. And when gold hit an all-time high, the news headlines were like, this is so strange. There's no explanation. Why was gold so expensive all of a sudden? It's probably nothing. It's probably going to crash again. Don't mind, like, don't look over here, nothing to see here kind of thing. So there's this big public relations sort of reaction to these forces, these market forces that I would like to think actually reflect the wider general public's awakening to some of these things. And maybe it's not too wide and not too general yet, but that is something to look out for, this awakening in people's, not just their understanding, but their actual habits and their choices that they make with their money.
Indeed, I think that the natural propensity to go to gold is just so ingrained in the human psyche because of the thousands of years of experience of holding gold that pretty much every society has gone through. And gold is actually money because of the fact that it's durable, divisible, very reliable store of value that generally maintains its integrity pretty well. It's a bit clunky, but it's just like a better form of money when compared to other commodities, and it's proven the ultimate test of time. And I like the fact that people are buying that and cryptocurrencies as well, because say what you want about cryptocurrencies, at least that's an emergent type of alternative speculative asset that people are coming together to prop up voluntarily, not like central banking fiat money, which is done by the barrel of a gun. It is the opposite of a spontaneous emergent money. And I do see all the commodities, cryptocurrencies, all of that on the uptick as people start to lose trust with the overall political system and economic system as well. And that is a very positive development, and we should be encouraging it because not everything is going to be resolved politically. In fact, most of these elected officials are completely brainwashed into thinking the Federal Reserve is normal.
Well, yeah, and these times are just ripe for they're ripe for people to be changing their minds about very big things. So that's why we're covering this in a wide net sort of way to sort of forecast maybe what we can dig deeper into in future episodes, Jose, and we'd love to cover the societal aspects, the economic aspects, maybe in individual episodes or just as the news comes about, because the Fed is going to be playing a more central role, not just in the monetary system, but in the story of America's transition, whatever direction we go in this November. So with that, Jose, why don't we throw in some plugs where people can find your work and mine?
Well, if you want to follow my work, just head to Twitter at Jose Al Nino. And for my general blogging and subscribing to my email newsletter, just go to josealnino.com. I have tons of sections where my content can be found there. And I'm writing for antiwar.com, Mises.org, among other websites. And yeah, if you just Google my name, you'll find something on any of those websites. I'm very active as far as writing is concerned, but the most reliable places you can find me, though, are on Twitter and my website and mailing list.
Yeah, the mailing list is excellent, and I really enjoy opening up those emails from Jose. From my side, you can go to nickhankoff.com. On Twitter, it's at Nick Hankoff. I'm on Facebook as well, going to be launching a podcast. I have a couple episodes out now, and that can be found at nickhankoff.com. There's gonna be a grand reopening for that show, so I look forward to bringing that to you guys, covering some of the same topics we're covering here on the Order and Liberty podcast. Thank you so much for listening. That was Jose Niño. My name is Nick Hankoff. We sure do appreciate you guys tuning in, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Peace.